have been having sex and writing songs about it and carving statues of it and changing fashion for it since the dawn of humanity. But it wasn't until fairly recently, the 1940s, that serious Western scientific study of sex began, and by most accounts, you can thank one guy for that. Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey was born in 1894 in New Jersey to poor, strict Methodist parents. He studied entomology in college, graduating with degrees in biology and psychology before heading to Harvard. His doctoral thesis was on the genealogy of gall wasps, a subject he tackled with intensity, meticulously collecting over 5 million samples, measuring hundreds of thousands of specimens. And wasps are interesting and everything, but Kinsey's interests drifted toward human sexuality, and his research at Indiana University paved the way for decades of study into sex. He surveyed thousands of men and women about their sexual habits and histories and found all sorts of interesting things related to sexual preferences, masturbation, orgasms, and premarital sex. He established the Kinsey scale, indicating degrees of sexual orientation, and went on to write the seminal text on sexual behavior in the human male and female, respectively. Like many of the first researchers of human behavior, Kinsey and his colleagues were, and in some ways still are, pretty controversial. But he definitely succeeded in two very important tasks. One, he was an early adopter of a scientific approach to studying sex, and two, he showed that the popular perception of what people do and don't do sexually versus what people actually do and feel was often very different. Since then, we've seen innumerable sex-related studies examining the physiological, psychological, and social elements of sex. And, there's a whole lot of lingering misinformation and judgy morality swirling around the subject of sex. It can be a tricky topic for sure, but we are here to clear some things up.
Okay, this is our documentary on the motives for sex. Sam's gonna start talking about sexual drive, and then I'll be talking about.
So sexual motivation or sex drive is the impulse to gratify sexual needs either through direct sexual activity or through apparently unrelated activities. And many scientists believe that sexual motivation is one of the most important aspects of humanity, because if we were not motivated to have sex, then there would be no reproduction and the human race would eventually die out. Two scientists, David Buss and Sidney Meston, performed a study, and they both agreed that why we have sex is extremely important but rarely studied, because many scientists just assume that the answer is obvious, but people actually have different reasoning for having sex, and some of which are very complex.
So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the reasons for having sex. We're going to go more into detail later in the video, but right now I'm just going to give a general overview. So the first one is going to be physical. The second is going to be goal attainment. Third would be emotional. Fourth is insecurity. And like I said, we're going to go more into detail and give examples later on in the video. And that was according to Masters and Johnson, which are a couple that studies everything about sex, and we're going to get more into that later as well. It also says that men have a significantly more, they have a higher sex drive than women. And their motives for sex are usually more physically driven than women are usually more emotional.
Alfred Kinsey, who first decided to study the genealogy of wasps, deferred his studies to analyze human sexual behavior around 1948. He was also the first major scientist to do so. Kinsey found the shocking percentages of people who masturbated and the people who had premarital sex, and he attempted to use the scientific method in order to study this. He showed us that our perception about what others are doing is actually much different than what we think. Before Kinsey, people believed that they were one of the few people who actually masturbated, and Kinsey actually helped people realize that they were very wrong about human sexual activity.
Two other famous scientists that studied sexual desire was William Masters and Virginia Johnson. They brought hundreds of volunteers into their labs and observed them having sex. They used multiple tools to measure penile length and blood flow, as well as vaginal expansion and lubrication. And their results were very extensive, as they performed thousands of trials over a 20-year period. They also tried to cure homosexuality, but claimed a 30% failure rate. They came up with the psychological breakdown called the sexual response cycle. As you see here, it starts with the initial excitement, which is the genitalia areas sees an increase in blood flow, as well as respiration and heart rate increasing. Then you go into the plateau phase, which is respiration and heart rate continue at an elevated level, and the genital secretes fluids. Third is the orgasms, which would be rhythmic genital contractions, as well as respiration and heart rate increases further, accompanied by a pleasure pleasurable euphoria. Fourth is the resolution phase, which is respiration and heart rate return to normal resting states. Men undergo a refractory period, a period that must relapse before another orgasm, whereas women can have multiple orgasms in a row.
You wrote a book once that I couldn't understand at all. It's about
Human sexual
17,000
response.
pages. What was it called? Human Sexual Response.
A physiology textbook.
I know, and the pictures weren't interesting at all, you know. I'm right about sex fantasies.
You are. There are always two types of people. Those that have sex fantasies and admit it, those that have sex fantasies and don't.
And know it?
And don't.
And don't.
And
Oh, don't admit it. I see. I see. Yeah. You know, the old Monsignor said 95% of all boys masturbate and the other 5% are lying. That's
Exactly.
sort of the same thing. But it's true. You even tell, there's a story, apparently it's not from your work, but you draw from another. A woman's sex fantasy was intimacy with rock stars. So she gets on the tour as a groupie, and she, guess what, with Mick Jagger. And it wasn't anything like her sex fantasy.
And Phil, the reason that happens over and over again is our fantasies are ideal creations. They're wonderful, private moments. Everything is blissful.
As we mentioned before with the Masters and Johnson study, one of their aims was to cure homosexuality, but they found that homosexuality isn't related to traumatic childhood experiences or parenting styles, masculinity and femininity, or the sexual orientation of our parents. So it'd be more nature and less nurture. Certain brain structures are different in homo and heterosexual males, but that doesn't mean that genetics cause these. Most current research points to the prenatal environment that may alter the brain structures that would influence sexual orientation.
As we said in the introduction, there's many reasons for having sex, the first of which is physical, which includes tension relief, pleasure, physical desirability, and seeking experiences. The second is goal attainment, which includes social status, revenge, and pregnancy. The third would be emotional, which includes love, commitment, expression. And the fourth is insecurity, which can help boost self-esteem, relieve pressure, and guard your mate. Another thing that leads to sex is hormones and their sexual responses. Testosterone appears to promote sexual desire in both sexes. Documentation is included in several studies of both men and women. However, hormones are not strictly motivating sexual desire. They can be controlled to a great extent by physiological over the biological sources.
One of the most influential scientists when it comes to studying sex is actually Freud, and he studied libido, which was the seeking of pleasure in general. He also studied what sex drives likely to be sublimated to achieve socially acceptable goals. He also found sex drive develops throughout most of the individual's life in different stages, beginning in infancy, and suggested it could become fixed in one of those immature stages and not pass on to the mature adult stage of sexuality. And on the topic of arousal and orgasm, Freud differentiated between immature clitoral orgasms and mature vaginal orgasms in women, whereas Kinsey suggested that females and males had similar orgasms, but that females were less sexual. Masters and Johnson asserted that women's capacity for sexual responses surpassed men's, but didn't examine the differences based on developmental, experiential, or cultural factors. So in conclusion, you could see there are many different psychologists that have put their efforts towards studying the motives for sex. We looked at Freud, Kinsey, and Masters and Johnson, and they all have different reasons, but overall, it seems to be pretty much the same. So that was our documentary on the sex and the motives for it.